In the wild frontier, destiny arrives not on golden carriages but on dusty trains carrying broken dreams. Sometimes the greatest journeys begin with the deepest betrayals. The evening train wheezed to a stop at Thundervale Station with a final burst of steam that seemed to echo Maria Stone's own exhausted sigh. At 49, she had traveled across 3 states with nothing but a worn leather suitcase and a heart full of desperate hope. The letters from Jacob Corbett had promised her a new life, a husband who would cherish her weathered hands and understand her quiet strength. She had sold everything she owned in Missouri to make this journey west. The wooden platform creaked under her boots as she stepped down, her brown traveling dress dusty from the long ride. The conductor tipped his cap and disappeared back into the train car, leaving her alone as the locomotive pulled away into the growing darkness. She stood beside her suitcase, watching the sun sink behind the jagged mountain peaks that surrounded the small frontier town. Minutes stretched into an hour. The station grew empty except for the rhythmic ticking of the telegraph machine inside the depot. Maria's hands trembled as she opened Jacob's last letter, reading his promise once more in the fading light. "I will be there to meet you, my dearest Maria. We shall be married within the week." You waiting for someone?" A deep voice startled her from her thoughts. A man approached from the shadows near the freight car, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden planks. He was perhaps 45, with sun-weathered skin and honest eyes beneath the brim of his worn hat. "Jacob Corbett," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was supposed to meet me here." The stranger, his expression darkened. He removed his hat, revealing graying hair. "Name is Jack Hunter, ma'am. I run cattle outside town. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but Jacob Corbett left Thundervale 3 days ago. Owed money to every card table and saloon from here to Denver. Sheriff was looking for him too." Maria felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The suitcase slipped from her numb fingers and hit the platform with a dull thud. All her savings, all her hope, all her faith in a future that had seemed so certain just moments before. "I know this is forward," Jack continued, his voice gentle but firm. "But I have a small ranch in the foothills. It is not much, but it is honest work and honest living. I need a partner, someone who understands that life out here is hard but fair. Not love, perhaps, but respect. 2 people against a harsh world." The chapel bells were ringing midnight when Maria Stone became Maria Hunter, her hand steady as she signed the marriage papers by candlelight. The wagon bounced over rocky terrain as Jack guided his 2 horses through the winding mountain trail. Dawn was breaking over the peaks, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. Maria sat beside him in silence, her hands folded in her lap, watching the wild landscape unfold before them. This was nothing like the gentle rolling hills of Missouri she had left behind. "There," Jack pointed ahead as they crested a small ridge. "Home." The ranch nestled in a natural bowl between towering rock formations, protected from the worst of the mountain winds. A 2-room log cabin sat beside a creek that sparkled in the morning light, with weathered barn and corrals spreading out behind it. The structure was simple but solid, built to withstand the harsh winters that swept down from the high country. Jack helped her down from the wagon, his touch brief and respectful. "The bedroom is yours," he said, carrying her suitcase to the smaller of the 2 rooms. "I will sleep in the main room by the fireplace. We share the work equally, and we share the profits equally." "Fair." Maria examined her new home with the practical eye of a woman who had managed a household for decades. The cabin was clean but sparse, with basic furniture and thick walls that would keep out the cold. Through the single window, she could see cattle grazing in the distance, their dark shapes moving slowly across the golden grass. "Fair," she agreed, rolling up her sleeves. "What needs doing first?" The days that followed established their rhythm. Jack rose before dawn to tend the cattle, mending fences and checking water sources in the far pastures. Maria threw herself into the domestic work with fierce determination, patching holes in the roof where winter storms had torn away the wooden shingles, learning to cook over the stone fireplace, and caring for the horses in the barn. She had expected to feel like a stranger in this harsh land, but something about the mountain air and endless sky called to a part of her soul she had forgotten existed. Her hands, soft from years of indoor work, grew calloused and strong. Her back ached from the unfamiliar labor, but it was an honest ache, earned through useful work. When the first blizzard of the season struck without warning, they worked side by side to bring the cattle into the shelter of the lower pasture. Snow swirled around them like a living thing as they rode through the storm, Maria learning to trust her horse, his instincts when she could barely see 10 feet ahead. "You did well today," Jack told her that evening as they sat by the fire, both exhausted and soaked to the skin. It was the first real praise he had given her, and she felt something warm kindle in her chest that had nothing to do with the flames dancing in the hearth. Outside, the wind howled like a lonely spirit, but inside the cabin, two people who had started as strangers began to discover what it meant to be partners. The screams from the barn cut through the night like a knife. Maria bolted upright in her bed, hearing Jack, his boots already pounding across the wooden floor of the main room. She pulled on her robe and rushed outside, following the glow of his lantern toward the desperate sounds. Inside the barn, their best mare was down on her side, sides heaving with the effort of a birth gone wrong. Jack knelt beside the animal, his face grim in the flickering light. Blood stained the straw beneath them. "The foal is turned wrong," he said without looking up. "I cannot get it positioned right. My hands are too big." Maria did not hesitate. She knelt beside him in the dirty straw, rolling up her sleeves. "Tell me what to do." For the next 3 hours, they worked together in the lamplight. Maria followed Jack, his quiet instructions, her smaller hands reaching where his could not, feeling for the tiny hooves that needed to be turned. The mare, its breathing grew labored, and more than once Maria thought they would lose both mother and foal. "There," she whispered finally, feeling the shift they had been fighting for. "I think it is right now." Jack nodded, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. "Now we wait and see if she has strength left to finish this." They sat in the straw beside the exhausted mare, not speaking, both covered in blood and birthing fluid. When the foal finally slipped into the world, wet and perfect, Maria felt tears she had not expected running down her cheeks. "You did that," Jack said softly, watching the tiny horse struggle to its feet. "You saved them both." The next morning brought the weekly mail delivery. Among the usual supplies and newspapers was a letter addressed to Maria Stone, written in a familiar hand. "Jacob Corbett." This writing was as smooth as his lies had been. Maria read it once, standing by the kitchen window. He begged her forgiveness, claimed he had been detained by business, promised to come for her soon. The same empty words that had brought her to Thunder Vale in the first place. Without a word, she walked to the fireplace and dropped the letter into the flames. Jack watched from his chair at the table, saying nothing as the paper curled and blackened. "I made my choice," she said simply, turning back to her morning chores. Outside, the mare and her foal grazed peacefully in the morning sun, alive because two people had trusted each other completely in the dark hours before dawn. That trust, Maria realized, was worth more than all of Jacob Corbett's pretty promises. The messenger arrived on a lathered horse just as the sun reached its peak. Maria was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard the thunder of hooves. Jack emerged from the barn, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle that hung by the door. "You Jack Hunter?" the young man called out, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. His face was flushed with excitement and fear. "Got word from town. That gambler Corbett is back, and he is asking questions about your wife." Maria felt the wet sheets slip from her hands into the dust. Jack, his face hardened like granite as he stepped protectively closer to her. "What kind of questions?" Jack asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Says she was promised to him first. Says he has legal papers proving their engagement. Sheriff does not want trouble, but Corbett brought men with him." "Hard men." Jack nodded grimly and pressed a silver dollar into the messenger's palm. "Ride back to town. Tell anyone who will listen that Maria Hunter is my wife, legal and proper. Tell them we will defend what is ours." As the messenger galloped away, Jack turned to Maria. Her face was pale but determined. "How many men did he bring?" she asked. "Does not matter," Jack replied. "This is our home, our land, our life." He walked into the cabin and emerged with both his rifles and his pistol. "Can you shoot?" Maria took the smaller rifle from his hands, checking the mechanism with practiced ease. "My father taught me to hunt rabbits when I was 12. I have not forgotten." They spent the afternoon preparing their defenses. Jack positioned himself on the barn roof with clear sight lines to the approach road. Maria took the window facing the creek, where riders might try to circle behind them. They loaded every weapon they owned and set boxes of ammunition within easy reach. The attack came at dawn, just as the first light touched the mountain peaks. The crack of rifle fire echoed off the rock walls as bullets splintered the cabin door. Maria pressed herself against the log wall beside the window, her heart pounding but her hands steady. Through the morning mist, she could see muzzle flashes from the ridge above them. Jack returned fire from the barn, his shots precise and deliberate. When one of the attackers broke cover to rush toward the cabin, Maria took careful aim and squeezed the trigger. The man spun and fell, clutching his shoulder. His companions dragged him back into the rocks, and an uneasy silence fell over the ranch. "That was a warning," Jack called out across the yard. "Next one will not be so lucky." But they both knew this was only the beginning. The chicken thieves struck 3 nights running before Jack finally caught one. Maria heard the commotion from the henhouse and rushed outside with her rifle, expecting another attack from Corbett,'s men. Instead, she found Jack wrestling with a small figure in the moonlight. "Let me go," a young voice cried out, fierce and desperate. "I was not stealing nothing." Jack hauled the intruder toward the cabin, and in the lamplight Maria saw it was a girl, perhaps 12 years old, thin as a rail and dirty as a wild animal. Her clothes were torn and too large, and her dark hair hung in tangled mats around a face marked by hunger and fear. "Found her stuffing chickens into a sack," Jack said, but his voice lacked its usual hardness. "Says her name is Annie." The girl glared at them both with defiant green eyes. "My stepfather sent me. He is sick and needs food. I will pay you back when we get money." Maria studied the child more carefully, noting the bruises on her thin arms and the way she flinched when Jack moved too quickly. She had seen that look before, in her own mirror, years ago when her first husband, his drinking, had turned violent. "Where is this stepfather of yours?" Maria asked gently. "Up in the cave by Willow Creek. He has been poorly since we got to these parts." "Annie," his voice cracked slightly. "He just needs to get well, then we will move on." Jack and Maria exchanged glances. They both knew about the cave system near Willow Creek, and they both knew what kind of man would send a child to steal rather than ask for help honestly. "You are hungry," Maria said, not making it a question. "Come inside. We will talk after you have eaten." Annie devoured the plate of beans and cornbread like she had not seen food in days. While she ate, Maria gently cleaned the dirt from her face and examined the worst of the bruises. The child's story emerged in broken pieces between bites. Her mother had died the previous winter. Her stepfather drank away what little money they had and blamed Annie for their troubles. When they fled their last town owing debts, he had grown meaner and more unpredictable. "You cannot go back to him," Maria said firmly when the tale was finished. "Annie," his eyes widened with fear, "he will come looking for me. He will be powerful, angry." "Let him come," Jack said quietly from his chair by the fire. "This ranch has room for one more defender." That night, they gave Annie the small storage room off the kitchen, with clean blankets and a sturdy door that locked from the inside. When Maria checked on her an hour later, the girl was still awake, staring at the ceiling with eyes too old for her young face. "You are safe here," Maria whispered. "I promise you that." For the first time since her arrival, Annie smiled. They came in the darkest hour before dawn, when the moon had set and the stars provided the only light. Maria heard the horses first, their hooves muffled but not silent on the rocky ground. She shook Jack awake and crept to Annie's room. "Wake up, child," she whispered urgently. "Take your rifle and get to the root cellar like we practiced." Annie nodded, her young face serious in the dim light. She had learned quickly in the weeks since joining them, becoming as deadly with a rifle as any grown man. The 3 of them had drilled their defensive positions until they could move without thinking. "Maria Hunter," Corbett, his voice cut through the pre-dawn silence like a blade. "Come out here and face your lawful husband. You have been living in sin with that rancher long enough." Jack was already on the barn roof, his rifle trained on the shapes moving in the darkness. Maria took her position at the cabin window, her heart steady despite the danger. They had both known this moment would come. "You have no claim on her," Jack shouted back. "She is my wife, legal and proper. I have papers that say different." Corbett replied, "Send her out, or we will burn you all out." The first shot came from the rocks to the east, splintering the wood near Maria's head. She returned fire immediately, her bullet sparking off stone. The battle erupted in earnest as muzzle flashes lit up the mountainside like deadly fireflies. Annie had positioned herself in the hayloft with a clear view of the creek approach. When 2 of Corbett's men tried to circle behind the cabin, her rifle cracked twice in quick succession. One man fell into the water with a splash, while the other scrambled back to cover. The fight raged for an hour, bullets whining through the air and thudding into wood and stone. Jack picked off one attacker who got too bold, while Maria kept the others pinned down with steady, accurate fire. But she could see they were slowly being surrounded. "Enough," Corbett finally called out. "I am coming to talk." Hold your fire! He stepped into the open, his hands visible but close to his guns. In the growing dawn light, Maria could see he was older, softer than she had imagined. His fine clothes were dusty from the trail, and his face showed the marks of too much whiskey and too many card games. "Maria, my dear," he said, his voice smooth as honey. "This has all been a terrible misunderstanding. Come with me now, and no one else needs to die." Maria stepped out of the cabin, her rifle in her hands. "I am not your dear, and I am not going anywhere." "Then you have chosen your fate," Corbett snarled, his hand moving toward his pistol. 2 shots rang out as one. Maria fired from the cabin steps while Annie's rifle cracked from the loft window. Corbett screamed and spun sideways, blood streaming from his shoulder and leg as he collapsed into the dust. "Get him out of here!" one of his men shouted, rushing forward to drag their wounded leader toward the horses. "This fight is over." Within minutes, the surviving gunman had loaded Corbett onto a horse and disappeared into the darkness, leaving only bloodstains and silence behind. They found scattered bloodstains in the yard where Corbett had fallen, but no bodies to bury. The gunmen had taken their wounded leader and vanished into the night, leaving behind only spent cartridge cases and the memory of fear in their eyes. Word would spread that the Hunter Ranch was not to be trifled with. In the days that followed, the 3 survivors set about rebuilding what the battle had damaged. Bullet holes scarred the cabin walls, and the barn door hung crooked on its hinges. But their hands were steady, and their purpose was clear. Annie threw herself into creating a garden plot near the kitchen window, turning the hard earth with determination that surprised even Maria. The girl had found something she had never known before, a place where she belonged, where her strength was valued rather than feared. "This soil is good," Annie announced one morning, holding up a handful of dark earth. "We can grow beans and squash here, maybe even some corn if the season is long enough." Maria smiled, watching the child who was no longer quite a child work the ground with calloused hands. "Your mother would be proud to see you now." Jack spent his evenings carving into the wooden gatepost that marked their property line. With patient strokes of his knife, he cut the date of their victory deep into the weathered wood, May 15, 1881, the day we chose to stand. The marriage that had begun as a practical arrangement slowly transformed into something deeper. Not the passionate love of young people, but the steady affection of 2 souls who had weathered storms together. They began to sit closer by the evening fire, and sometimes Maria would rest her hand on Jack's shoulder as she passed behind his chair. One morning in early summer, Annie came running to the cabin with something cupped in her hands. "Look what I found by the creek," she called out, her voice bright with excitement. It was a young deer, barely old enough to walk, with a wounded leg that had left it unable to keep up with its mother. The animal was weak from hunger and fear, its large brown eyes reflecting the same desperation Annie herself had once shown. "Can we keep it?" she asked, already knowing the answer by the way Maria was preparing a makeshift splint. "I want to call it Wind, because it will run fast when it gets better." They built a small pen behind the cabin and took turns feeding the fawn with warm milk from their gentlest cow. As Wind grew stronger, so did the bonds between the 3 people who had saved each other from loneliness and danger. For the first time since leaving Missouri, Maria heard genuine laughter echoing from the walls of her home. It was Annie's laugh, bright and unafraid, mixed with the deeper chuckles of Jack as he watched the young deer chase butterflies in the meadow. The sound settled into Maria's heart like a benediction, a promise that some endings could also be beginnings. Years rolled past like seasons, each one adding strength to their small family and depth to the roots they had planted in the mountain soil. The ranch remained modest in size but grew rich in contentment. Their cattle multiplied, their garden flourished, and Wind the deer became a gentle giant who grazed peacefully among the horses. Annie grew from a frightened child into a capable young woman, her aim with a rifle still true and her knowledge of the land deep as any born to it. She learned to read the weather in the clouds and find water by watching where the birds flew at dawn. Occasionally, strangers would appear on their mountain road. Most were harmless travelers seeking directions or a meal, and these they welcomed with frontier hospitality. But some came with darker purposes, drawn by rumors of a ranch where a woman and girl lived with only one man to protect them. These unwelcome visitors learned quickly that appearances could deceive. 3 rifles pointed from strategic positions had a way of changing hostile intentions into hasty departures. Word spread along the outlaw trails that the Hunter Ranch was not an easy target. One autumn day, A well-dressed man arrived claiming to be searching for his runaway daughter. He described a girl who sounded remarkably like Annie, though he called her by a different name and spoke of taking her back to a life of servitude and beatings. Jack met him at the property line and spoke in tones that brooked no argument. "There is no girl here by that name. You have the wrong ranch, stranger. Best you move along before dark." The man rode away empty-handed, but not before casting a long look back at the cabin where Annie watched from behind the window curtain, her hand resting on her rifle. That evening, as they sat around their table sharing a simple supper, Maria felt the weight of all they had built together. The walls that sheltered them had been raised by their own hands. The food they ate came from soil they had tended. The safety they enjoyed had been won through courage and determination. Each spring, Maria performed a ritual that belonged only to her. She would walk to the far meadow where the wildflowers bloomed earliest and gather an armload of dry brush and dead branches. Then she would build a small fire and watch the smoke rise toward the mountains, carrying away the last shadows of her former life. Annie and Jack never asked about these solitary ceremonies, understanding instinctively that some healing required privacy. They would simply ensure that supper was waiting when she returned, her face peaceful and her step lighter. Time moved differently in the mountains, measured not in calendar pages but in the turning of seasons and the gradual changes that came with age. Jack's hair had gone completely gray, and his hands sometimes trembled when he thought no one was watching. The man who had once lifted hay bales with ease now moved more carefully, his steps deliberate and thoughtful. Maria and Annie began taking on the heavier work without discussion or ceremony. They mended the fences in the far pastures and moved the cattle to fresh grazing. Jack still rode out each morning to check on the herd, but his routes grew shorter, and he returned earlier each day. "I am not ready to be put out to pasture yet," he would grumble when Maria suggested he rest more. But she could see the weariness in his eyes, the way he paused to catch his breath after climbing the porch steps. One morning in late autumn, Jack saddled his horse as usual and rode out to check the water sources in the high meadow. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the aspen trees blazed gold against the dark pine slopes. He looked back once at the cabin, where smoke rose straight up from the chimney in the still air. When he did not return by sunset, Maria and Annie rode out with lanterns, following his familiar trail. They found him beneath the old pine tree that marked the boundary of their highest pasture, sleeping peacefully with his back against the massive trunk. His horse grazed nearby, its reins trailing in the grass. His face was calm, his weathered hands folded in his lap as if he had simply decided to rest and watch the sunset one final time. There was no struggle, no pain visible in his features, only the deep contentment of a man who had lived his last years exactly as he chose. They buried him there beneath the pine tree, where he could watch over the land he had loved. Instead of a cross, Maria placed his favorite fishing rod against the headstone they carved from mountain granite. It seemed fitting for a man who had found peace in simple things. For 3 days afterward, Maria spoke to no one. She performed her daily tasks with mechanical precision, feeding the animals and preparing meals, but her voice remained silent. Annie respected her grief, understanding that some sorrows required solitude to heal properly. On the 4th morning, Maria stood at the kitchen window watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold. "He gave me dignity," she said quietly, the first word she had spoken since the funeral. Not many men would have done that for a stranger. Annie came to stand beside her, both women gazing toward the distant pine where Jack rested. "He taught me what a good man looked like," Annie replied. "I will remember that always." The letter arrived on a day when the first snow was dusting the mountain peaks, carried by a traveling merchant who rarely ventured so far into the high country. It bore no return address, only Maria's name written in an unfamiliar feminine hand. Inside was a single pressed wildflower, a prairie poppy dried to golden perfection, and a brief note. "I saw you at Thundervale Station years ago and have never forgotten your courage. Some journeys have no destination except freedom itself. A friend." Maria held the flower to the light, studying its delicate petals. Someone, somewhere, had understood what that night at the station had truly meant. The knowledge warmed her in ways she had not expected. Annie's 18th birthday came with a spring thaw, marked by a quiet celebration around their kitchen table. Whined the deer, now fully grown, watched through the window as they shared cake made from precious sugar and eggs. The young woman had grown tall and strong, her green eyes clear with purpose and wisdom beyond her years. "I have something for you," Maria said. rising from the table. She returned with a wooden box containing all the legal papers for the ranch, deeds, water rights, cattle brands, everything that made this place truly home. "I do not understand," Annie said, though her hands trembled as she touched the documents. "This ranch needs someone young enough to build its future," Maria explained gently. "You know, every stone and stream, every season and storm. It belongs to you now, as it should." Annie, his eyes filled with tears. "Where will you go?" Maria smiled, thinking of the pressed flower tucked carefully in her Bible. "West. I have never seen the ocean, and I find myself curious about what lies beyond the next mountain range." They spent the following weeks preparing for Maria's departure. She would take a small pack, her father, his rifle, and enough supplies for a journey with no fixed destination. Everything else would remain with Annie, who had become the daughter Maria had never born. On a morning when the air smelled of pine and possibility, Maria shouldered her pack and walked to the gate where Jack had carved their victory date so many years before. Annie stood beside Wind in the pasture, her hand raised in farewell. "Will you come back?" Annie called out. "Perhaps," Maria replied, though they both knew she would not. "Take care of our mountain." She walked westward along the old trail, her step steady and sure. Behind her, the ranch settled into its morning rhythm under new hands. Ahead lay unknown country, vast and wild and full of promise. For the first time in her life, Maria Stonehunter was truly free, free from the expectations of others, free from the weight of the past, free to write her own story on whatever road called to her restless heart. The mountains watched her go with ancient patience, knowing that some souls were meant to wander until they found their own horizon.